The Corthanian Empire stretched across 23 star systems like a giant web of power and control. Their massive silver warships moved through space with the confidence of rulers who had never been challenged. For 3,000 years they had been the undisputed masters of this corner of the galaxy. Every alien species they encountered either bowed down or got crushed under their might. When their long-range scouts first detected a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star, they barely gave it a second thought. The readings showed a young civilization that had just figured out how to travel faster than light. Their ships looked like metal boxes compared to the elegant curved designs of Corthanian vessels. The Empire's database simply labeled Earth as Primitive Species 4008-47 and moved on to more important matters. But Earth wasn't going to be ignored so easily. Ambassador Kim Hana stood in the launch bay of humanity's newest diplomatic ship, the Sol Dawn. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the data pad containing information that could save billions of lives. The ship itself wasn't much to look at compared to the alien vessels she'd soon encounter. It was built for function, not beauty, with thick armor plating and redundant systems that made it look more like a flying fortress than a diplomatic transport. The journey to Corthania Prime took 3 weeks through hyperspace. During that time, Kim Hana reviewed her presentation over and over. The data was clear, undeniable, and terrifying. 2 neutron stars were on a collision course that would happen in exactly 14 months. When they smashed into each other, the explosion would release more energy in 10 seconds than Earth's sun would produce in 10 billion years. Back on Earth, Dr. Park Jun-ho wasn't sleeping much these days. His team of astronomers and physicists had been working around the clock, running calculation after calculation. Every computer model showed the same horrifying result. The neutron star collision would send out waves of gravitational distortion and exotic radiation that would travel at the speed of light in all directions. The Corthanian Empire sat right in the path of destruction. The gravitational waves will be bad enough, Park Jun-ho explained to the emergency council meeting. They'll shake apart anything that isn't properly reinforced, but the real killer will be the exotic particles. Their energy-based technology will fail completely. Their power grids, life support systems, even their ships. Everything depends on controlled energy fields that these particles will disrupt. Earth's leaders made a difficult decision. They would try to warn everyone, even species that looked down on humanity. It was the right thing to do. When Kim Hana finally arrived at Corthania Prime, she was struck by the planet's incredible beauty. Crystal spires reached toward the sky, glowing with internal light. Flying vehicles moved in perfect patterns through the air, their movements controlled by some kind of energy field rather than crude mechanical engines. Everything seemed to pulse with a soft, harmonious energy. The Corthanian High Council met in a chamber that defied human understanding of architecture. The walls seemed to bend space itself, creating a room that felt both intimate and vast at the same time. 12 council members sat on platforms that floated in midair, their tall, pale forms draped in robes that shifted color like oil on water. Kim Hana had practiced her presentation in 17 different languages, but the Corthanians insisted on using their own translation system. As she began explaining the approaching disaster, she noticed the subtle changes in their expressions. At first, they seemed mildly curious, then dismissive, finally, openly amused. "You expect us to believe," said High Counselor Vexhai, his voice carrying harmonics that made human ears ring, "that your species, which has barely learned to leave its own star system, has discovered something that our scientists missed?" The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly. It was the kind of laughter adults might share when a child tries to explain why vegetables are actually candy. Kim Hana felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she pressed on. She showed them the mathematical models, the gravitational wave predictions, the radiation burst calculations. Each piece of evidence was met with polite but firm dismissal. The Corthanians had weather prediction systems that could forecast cosmic storms decades in advance. They had survived galactic catastrophes before humanity had even discovered fire. "Your concern is noted," High Counselor Vexhai said finally. But perhaps your time would be better spent learning from civilizations with actual experience in these matters. Meanwhile, back on Earth, humanity wasn't waiting for permission to act. Dr. Park Jun-ho's warnings had triggered a planet-wide preparation effort that was kept carefully quiet. Ship manufacturers began installing additional radiation shielding. Military engineers developed new power systems that could function even if exotic particles disrupted normal energy flow. The preparations weren't elegant like Corthanian technology, but they were thorough and practical. Humanity had learned long ago that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most reliable ones. 6 months had passed since Ambassador Kim Hana's humiliating visit to Corthania Prime, and the universe was starting to prove humanity right in the most terrifying way possible. The first signs were subtle, the kind of things that could easily be explained away by a civilization that didn't want to admit they'd made a mistake. Mining Station Keth 9 was the first to report problems. The facility floated in the asteroid belt of the Corthanian system's outer rim, its energy extractors pulling precious metals from chunks of space rock. The station's chief engineer, a veteran who'd worked in space for 40 years, noticed his equipment acting strangely. Power fluctuations happened every few hours, lasting just seconds, but causing the delicate extraction beams to flicker and fade. Probably just solar interference, he reported to his supervisors back on Corthania Prime. Nothing we can't handle. But the problems weren't limited to one station. Across Corthanian space, similar reports started trickling in. Transport. Ships found their navigation systems glitching during routine jumps. Communication arrays experienced brief but unexplained static bursts. Energy shields flickered on military vessels during patrol runs. The Empire's top scientists gathered to discuss these anomalies, but their pride wouldn't let them consider the obvious explanation. Dr. Vel Thara, the leading expert on cosmic phenomena, dismissed the reports during a prestigious scientific conference. "These are minor technical issues," she announced to an audience of the galaxy's brightest minds. "Our systems are so advanced that even the smallest irregularities get noticed and reported. Less sophisticated civilizations wouldn't even detect these minute variations." Meanwhile, Captain Lee Min-ho was having a very different conversation aboard his ship, the Busan Explorer. His small fleet of 5 human vessels had been positioned just outside Corthanian space for the past 3 months, officially conducting deep space research, but actually monitoring the approaching neutron star collision. "The readings are getting stronger," reported his science officer, Dr. Song Yuri. "Gravitational distortions are increasing right on schedule. The exotic particle density is climbing too, exactly like Dr. Park Jun-ho predicted." Lee Min-ho studied the data streaming across his screens. The human ships were specifically designed for this mission, with triple redundant mechanical systems and experimental shielding that could deflect the dangerous particles now flooding the region. Where Corthanian vessels relied on elegant energy, fields and plasma conduits, human ships used crude but reliable mechanical components that would keep working even in the harshest conditions. "Any response from the Corthanian government to our latest warning?" he asked his communications officer. "Nothing official, sir, but we're intercepting increased chatter about equipment failures throughout their territory. They're still calling it routine maintenance issues." That's when the real crisis began. The KS Harmony's End was a beautiful ship, even by Corthanian standards. The passenger liner stretched nearly a kilometer from bow to stern, its hull made of living crystal that pulsed with soft bioluminescent patterns. Inside, 800 Corthanian civilians were traveling from the outer colonies back to the homeworld for the Festival of Eternal Stars, their most important cultural celebration. Captain Lee Min-ho was reviewing sensor data when his tactical officer suddenly straightened in his chair. "Sir, we've got a ship in distress, Corthanian passenger liner, about 2 light minutes from our position." "What's their status?" "Dead in space, sir. No power signatures, no communication signals, no life support readings. But our deep scans show life signs aboard. Lots of them." Lee Min-ho didn't hesitate. "All ships change course immediately. We're going in." "Sir," his communications officer said carefully, "they haven't sent out a distress call. According to diplomatic protocols, we're not supposed to interfere with Corthanian vessels unless specifically requested. 800 people are about to die. Lee Minho replied firmly. I don't care about their pride or our protocols. The rescue operation took 6 hours. The human ships surrounded the disabled liner like protective wolves around an injured member of their pack. Emergency airlocks connected the vessels as human rescue teams moved through the darkened Corthanian ship, carrying portable life support equipment and emergency power cells. The Corthanian passengers were in various states of panic and confusion. Their ship's systems had failed suddenly and completely during a routine hyperspace jump. The exotic particles flooding the region had overwhelmed their energy-based technology, leaving them stranded in the void with failing life support and no way to call for help. What shocked them most wasn't the rescue itself, but the human equipment that made it possible. While their own advanced systems lay dead and useless, the crude-looking human devices worked perfectly. Mechanical air recyclers pumped fresh oxygen through the ship. Battery-powered lights illuminated the corridors. Simple but effective radiation detectors guided the rescue teams safely through areas where exotic particles had concentrated. How did you know to prepare for this? Asked one of the rescued passengers, a young Corthanian engineer who couldn't stop staring at the human equipment with fascination. Dr. Song Yuri, who was overseeing the technical aspects of the rescue, gave him a tired smile. Our ambassador, Kim Hana, tried to warn your government about this 8 months ago. Your High Council laughed at her. The engineer's face went through several color changes, the Corthanian equivalent of blushing with embarrassment. They said humans were too primitive to understand cosmic phenomena. Well, Dr. Song replied, helping him toward the airlock leading to a human ship. Apparently, being primitive has its advantages. Sometimes the simple solution is the one that actually works. Word of the rescue spread quickly through both human and Corthanian communication networks, though the two sides reported it very differently. Human news focused on the successful humanitarian mission and the vindication of their scientific warnings. Corthanian media mentioned only that a minor technical issue had been resolved with assistance from Allied vessels, carefully avoiding any mention of the word rescue or acknowledgement of human superiority and crisis preparedness. But among the 800 saved passengers, a different story was taking shape. They had seen firsthand how human technology succeeded where Corthanian engineering failed. They had experienced the efficiency and competence of human rescue operations. Most importantly, they had witnessed the simple human instinct to help others without being asked, without expecting reward, and without caring about pride or political considerations. The universe was sending its warning signals, and only one species was listening. The neutron-star collision happened exactly when Dr. Park Jun-ho said it would, down to the hour. 2 impossibly dense objects, each containing the mass of an entire sun, compressed into a sphere just 20 kilometers wide, smashed into each other at half the speed of light. The explosion that followed released more energy in 10 seconds than 1 trillion normal stars would produce in a year. The gravitational waves hit first, rippling through space itself like invisible tsunamis. On Corthania Prime, the planet's crystal spires began to vibrate in frequencies they were never designed to handle. The harmonious energy fields that held their cities together started fluctuating wildly. Buildings that had stood for thousands of years began to crack and sway. High Counselor Vexhai was in his meditation chamber when the first wave passed through the planet. The room's walls, which normally bent space in beautiful, impossible curves, suddenly snapped back to normal geometry. With a sound like breaking glass, emergency alarms began wailing throughout the capital city. But the elegant warning systems lasted only minutes before the next phase of the disaster arrived. The exotic particles came like an invisible flood, billions of subatomic bullets traveling at the speed of light. They passed through solid matter as if it didn't exist, but they played havoc with energy fields and plasma systems. Every piece of Corthanian technology that relied on controlled energy began failing simultaneously. The crystal cities went dark. First, their bioluminescent glow, which had burned continuously for millennia, flickered and died as the particles disrupted the delicate energy balance that kept them alive. Billions of Corthanians found themselves trapped in buildings that were no longer receiving power, with elevators that wouldn't work and communication systems that had gone completely silent. In orbit around dozens of Corthanian worlds, their mighty silver fleet became a collection of beautiful corpses drifting in space. The warships that had once patrolled trade routes with absolute authority now tumbled helplessly, their crews trapped inside vessels that had become elaborate tombs. Life support systems failed, navigation computers went dead, and weapons that could destroy planets became useless chunks of exotic metal. The death toll climbed rapidly into the billions, not from the initial disaster itself, but from the complete collapse of a civilization that had built everything around energy-based technology. Hospitals couldn't function without power. Air recycling systems shut down in underground cities. Transportation networks that moved millions of people daily simply stopped working. On the planet Corthania Prime alone, 2 billion souls found themselves cut off from everything that kept their society functioning. The lucky ones were near the surface where they could breathe natural air. The unlucky ones were deep underground in the crystal cities, where artificial life support had sustained populations for generations. That's when the human ships arrived. Admiral Choi Ji-won commanded the largest humanitarian fleet in human history. 200 vessels of every size and description had been rapidly converted for rescue operations over the past year. Hospital ships, cargo haulers, military transports, even luxury cruise liners had been retrofitted with radiation shielding and mechanical life support systems. The Admiral stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Soul's Promise, watching the devastation unfold on her screens. Where the Corthanian Empire had once displayed its power and glory, there was now only darkness and silence. Entire star systems had gone quiet, their communication networks dead, their energy signatures reduced to the faint heat of cooling metal. "Ma'am," reported her communications officer, Lieutenant Park Suman. "We're receiving automated distress signals from 17 different planets. Emergency broadcasts in multiple languages, but most of the transmission equipment seems to be failing. Any response from Corthanian Command Authority?" "Negative, ma'am. Their military command structure appears to be completely offline. We're not detecting any functional government communications anywhere in their territory." Admiral Choi took a deep breath. She had been preparing for this moment for over a year, ever since Ambassador Kim Hana's warnings had been laughed out of the Corthanian High Council. The human response fleet had been positioned just outside Corthanian space, waiting and hoping they would never be needed. "All ships begin rescue operations immediately. Priority goes to life support failures and medical emergencies. We'll sort out the politics later." The human ships moved into Corthanian space like a school of metal, fish swimming into a dying ocean. Where the Corthanian vessels drifted helplessly, human ships flew with perfect precision. Their mechanical engines worked flawlessly in the exotic particle field that had crippled every energy-based system in the Empire. The rescue operations were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human crews worked 18-hour shifts, moving from planet to planet, station to station, ship to ship. They pulled survivors from collapsed buildings, evacuated underground cities whose life support was failing, and transferred populations from dying worlds to temporary refugee camps on planets outside the disaster zone. Dr. Kim Hyun, Chief Medical Officer of the rescue fleet, found herself treating injuries and illnesses she'd never seen before. Corthanians, who had lived their entire lives in energy-regulated environments, were having severe reactions to the sudden loss of the fields that had sustained them. Their immune systems, weakened by generations of technological dependency, struggled to cope with natural environments. "It's like their entire species has forgotten how to live without artificial support," she explained to Admiral Choi during one of their daily briefings. "They're not weak exactly, but they've become so dependent on their technology that they can't adapt when it fails." The most frustrating part of the rescue effort wasn't the technical challenges or the massive scale of the disaster. It was dealing with the remaining Corthanian leadership, who seemed unable to accept their new reality. Commander Zeth Cole, one of the few surviving Corthanian military officers, had managed to establish a temporary command post using equipment salvaged from human ships. When he demanded to know why human vessels were operating normally in conditions that had destroyed the Empire's entire fleet, Admiral Choi's patience was already wearing thin. "How did your primitive ship survive when our advanced technology failed?" he asked, his tone still carrying traces of the old Corthanian arrogance despite his desperate circumstances. Admiral Choi looked at him across the cramped command center, surrounded by human equipment that was keeping him and his staff alive. Her response was calm but carried an edge that made several nearby officers step back. "We tried to warn you 18 months ago," she said simply. "Your High Council laughed at our ambassador and called us primitives who couldn't possibly understand cosmic phenomena. Ambassador Kim Hana gave you exact predictions, precise timelines, and detailed recommendations for hardening your systems against exotic particle bombardment." Commander Zeth Cole's color shifted through several shades of embarrassment, but he pressed on. "But how did you know to prepare your ships with such specific modifications?" "Because," Admiral Choi replied, her voice growing colder, "sometimes the primitives pay attention to things that the advanced civilizations are too proud to notice. We didn't ignore the science because it came from a younger species. We didn't dismiss the data because it challenged our assumptions about our own superiority." She gestured toward the screens showing human ships moving efficiently through space, while Corthanian vessels drifted as lifeless debris. "Your technology was more elegant than ours, more sophisticated, more beautiful. But when the universe threw something unexpected at both of us, our ugly, mechanical, redundant systems kept working, while your perfect energy-based systems became useless." The rescue operations continued for months, with human ships evacuating billions of Corthanian survivors to temporary settlements on worlds outside the disaster zone. The empire that had once controlled 23 star systems was reduced to refugee camps dependent entirely on human generosity and logistics. Throughout it all, Admiral Choi's message remained consistent. "We tried to warn you. Now we're trying to save you." The neutron star collision was just the beginning. What followed was like watching dominoes fall across an entire section of the galaxy, each disaster triggering the next in an unstoppable chain reaction. The gravitational waves had done more than just cripple Corthanian technology. They had fundamentally changed the fabric of space itself in dozens of star systems. 3 months after the initial catastrophe, solar storms began erupting across former Corthanian territory. Stars that had burned steadily for billions of years suddenly became unstable, throwing off massive bursts of radiation and charged particles. The star system of Corthania Prime, once the jewel of the Empire, watched in horror as their sun began flickering like a dying light bulb. Dr. Song Yuri, now serving as Chief Science Officer for the entire human relief effort, stood in the observation deck of a rescue ship watching one of these stellar tantrums unfold. The Corthanian sun was throwing off solar flares the size of small planets, each one powerful enough to sterilize the surface of any world caught in its path. "How long do we have?" asked Captain Lee Minho, who had been promoted to oversee evacuations in this sector. "The computer models show maybe 6 weeks before the next major flare," Dr. Song replied, not taking her eyes off the terrifying display. "If it follows the pattern we've seen in other systems, it'll be big enough to cook everything within the inner orbital zone." That included Corthania Prime, home to 12 billion souls who were already struggling to survive in the ruins of their crystal cities. The evacuation efforts had been going on for months, but they were hitting obstacles that had nothing to do with physics or engineering. The biggest problem wasn't moving people or finding places to put them. It was dealing with what remained of Corthanian leadership. High Marshal Kethdar had set up his temporary government in a converted human cargo ship, the only vessel large enough to house his staff and the portable equipment needed to coordinate what was left of Corthanian civilization. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the Empire's leadership was literally dependent on human charity for their basic survival, yet they seemed incapable of adjusting their attitude accordingly. The breaking point came during a coordination meeting in the cargo bay that now served as the Corthanian government's main conference room. Representatives from both species were planning the evacuation of a major population center when High Marshal Kethdar made an announcement that left the humans speechless. "All rescue ships will prioritize government officials and military personnel," he declared. his voice carrying the same commanding tone he'd used when the Empire still existed. Civilian populations will be evacuated only after essential personnel have been secured. Captain Lee Minho, who had been reviewing transport schedules, slowly looked up from his datapad. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "You heard correctly. The continuation of Corthanian government and military structure takes precedence over civilian evacuation. This is a direct order to all human vessels operating in our territory." The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the distant hum of the ship's mechanical air recyclers. Several human officers exchanged glances, waiting to see how their captain would respond to being given orders by someone whose entire civilization existed only because of human rescue efforts. Captain Lee Minho set down his datapad very carefully and looked directly at the High Marshal. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Marshal, let me make something very clear. You are not giving orders to human ships. You are not in command of human personnel. And you are definitely not in a position to decide who lives and who dies when we're the ones doing the saving." High Marshal Kethdar's color shifted to the deep purple that indicated extreme anger in Corthanian physiology. "Captain, you forget yourself. This is still Corthanian space, and these are still Corthanian citizens. We have the right to determine evacuation priorities." "Actually," Captain Lee replied, standing up slowly, "this stopped being Corthanian space the moment your empire ceased to exist. What you have now are refugee populations that survive entirely on human aid, using human ships, eating human food, and breathing air recycled by human equipment." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other Corthanian officials began shifting nervously, while human officers quietly moved their hands closer to their sidearms, not threatening, just ready. High Marshal Kethdar apparently decided to push the issue further. "Captain, there are still functional Corthanian military vessels in this sector. Perhaps you need a reminder of what happens to those who defy legitimate authority." That's when Captain Lee Minho's expression went completely cold. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, and spoke in a voice that could have froze helium. "Marshal, you're welcome to try. But let me remind you of a few facts. First, your functional military vessels are running on human-supplied power cells and human-manufactured spare parts. Second, every single one of your people currently breathing is doing so because we allow it. Third, we're the only thing standing between your species and complete extinction." He straightened up and crossed his arms. "So by all means, threaten us. Attack us if you think you can. But understand that we're the only reason your people are still alive, and that can change very quickly if you decide to test our patience." The standoff lasted for several long moments before High Marshal Kethdar apparently realized he was bluffing with an empty hand. But the damage was done. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through both human and Corthanian communication networks. The situation got even worse during the evacuation of Corthania Prime's capital city. As human rescue teams worked frantically to pull survivors from collapsed crystal spires, a group of Corthanian nobles approached Admiral Choi Jiwan with demands that made her question whether this species deserved saving. "Admiral," said Duchess Velthera, her ornate robes somehow still pristine despite the chaos around her, "my family and retinue require immediate transport to the luxury accommodations you've prepared for displaced persons of our status." "Admiral," Choi looked up from the tactical display showing rescue operations across the planet. Thousands of red dots indicated locations where human teams were pulling civilians from rubble, racing against time as the planet's infrastructure continued to collapse. "Ma'am, we don't have luxury accommodations. We have refugee camps with basic life support, food distribution, and medical care." "That's unacceptable," the Duchess replied haughtily. "We are members of the noble houses of Corthania. We cannot be expected to live in common refugee facilities with ordinary citizens." Admiral Choi felt something snap inside her. She looked past the Duchess to where human rescue workers were carrying injured Corthanian children from a collapsed school, their uniforms covered in dust and debris from 12 hours of non-stop search and rescue operations. "You know what's unacceptable?" Admiral Choi said, her voice deadly quiet. What's unacceptable is that we have rescue teams who haven't slept in 36 hours pulling your people out of rubble, while you're standing here complaining about accommodation quality." She turned back to her tactical display where more red dots were appearing as additional collapse sites were identified. "What's unacceptable is that we warned your government about this disaster 18 months ago, and instead of preparing, you laughed at us." The Duchess opened her mouth to respond, but Admiral Choi held up a hand to stop her. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to save who we can, when we can, in the order that makes the most sense for rescue operations. We're not going to waste time sorting people by social status or government rank. Everyone gets the same basic care, the same basic shelter, and the same chance at survival." She finally looked back at the Duchess, and her expression was harder than diamond. "If you don't like those terms, you're free to make your own arrangements. But this is how human rescue operations work. And since we're the ones doing the rescuing, we're the ones who set the rules." Word of Admiral Choi's declaration spread through the human fleet like wildfire. For the first time since the disaster began, rescue crews felt like their leadership was truly backing them up. They'd been watching Corthanian officials make demands, while their own people died, and finally someone had said what everyone was thinking. The age of Corthanian demands was officially over. From now on, humanity would save who they chose to save, in the order they chose to save them, according to human values and human priorities. And if the former rulers of a fallen empire didn't like it, they were welcome to try surviving on their own. 8 months after the neutron star collision that destroyed their civilization, the mighty Corthanian Empire had become nothing more than a footnote in galactic history books. What had once been 23 star systems under unified rule was now a scattered collection of refugee camps, temporary settlements, and emergency shelters spread across dozens of different worlds. The transformation was staggering to witness. High Marshal Kethdar, who had once commanded fleets capable of conquering entire sectors, now sat behind a folding metal desk in a converted cargo container, reviewing supply distribution lists. His grand title meant nothing when his primary responsibility was making sure refugees got their daily rations of human-manufactured food packets. The refugee settlement on New Geneva had become the largest Corthanian population center in the Sierra galaxy, housing nearly 50 million survivors. What had once been an empty agricultural world was now covered with prefabricated human housing units, medical centers, and food distribution facilities. The structures were purely functional. No elegant curves or crystal spires, just simple buildings designed to keep people alive and healthy. Dr. Kim Hyun walked through the settlement's main medical complex, observing how dramatically the Corthanian survivors had changed over the past months. The physical transformation was obvious. Their pale, almost translucent skin had taken on healthier tones from exposure to natural sunlight. Their bodies, once weakened by generations of technological dependency, were becoming stronger through manual labor and natural exercise. But the psychological changes were even more profound. The arrogance that had once defined Corthanian culture was slowly being replaced by something resembling humility. Children who had grown up believing their species was superior to all others were now learning side by side with human teachers, discovering that the primitive humans actually knew quite a lot about surviving in a hostile universe. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, other civilizations were watching humanity's unprecedented rescue operation with growing amazement and respect. The Zephyrian Republic, which had previously dismissed Earth's diplomatic overtures, sent a formal embassy requesting immediate establishment of full diplomatic relations. The Crystalline Consortium, known for their isolationist policies, opened their borders to human scientific expeditions for the first time in their recorded history. Ambassador Park Sora found herself overwhelmed with requests from species that had barely acknowledged Earth's existence just a year earlier. Her office on the human diplomatic station had become the busiest location in the galaxy, with representatives from dozens of civilizations waiting for meetings. "It's remarkable," she explained to Admiral Choi during one of their regular briefings. "The Altarian Federation wants us to review their disaster preparedness protocols. The Meridian Alliance is requesting human advisors for their deep space monitoring systems. Even the ethereal dominion who consider physical beings beneath their notice have asked for copies of our cosmic phenomenon prediction models. The shift in galactic politics was unprecedented. Species that had spent centuries looking down on younger civilizations were suddenly eager to learn from humanity's practical, no-nonsense approach to survival. The elegant, sophisticated technologies that had once been symbols of advanced civilization were being recognized as potential weaknesses when faced with unexpected challenges. But the most significant change was happening in a small office on New Geneva, where former High Marshal Kethdar was staring at a document that would officially end the last pretense of Corthanian independence. The formal request for assistance in rebuilding Corthanian society lay open on his desk, its terms stark and non-negotiable. After months of bureaucratic delays and behind-the-scenes negotiations, the surviving Corthanian leadership had finally accepted the reality of their situation. The document was brutally simple. In exchange for human assistance in rebuilding their civilization, the Corthanians would formally acknowledge the superiority of human scientific knowledge in matters of cosmic phenomena. They would establish permanent respect protocols for human rescue and aid personnel. Most importantly, they would never again ignore or dismiss warnings from Earth about potential galactic disasters. Kethdar's hand trembled slightly as he signed the document. With his signature, he was officially ending 3,000 years of Corthanian independence and acknowledging that his people's survival depended entirely on the generosity of the species they had once mocked as primitive. The document was immediately transmitted to Admiral Choi Ji-won, who was overseeing relief operations from her flagship. She read through the terms one final time before adding her own signature, officially binding humanity to the largest reconstruction project in galactic history. Within hours, news of the agreement spread across known space. Galactic media outlets, many of which had ignored Earth entirely just a year ago, were now focusing intense coverage on humanity's response to the Corthanian crisis. The most anticipated moment came when Admiral Choi agreed to a live interview broadcast across 17 different star systems. The journalist, a respected Altarian correspondent, asked the question that everyone in the galaxy wanted answered. Admiral Choi, your species has committed enormous resources to saving a civilization that openly mocked and dismissed you. Many observers are puzzled by this decision. Why did humanity choose to help those who showed you such disrespect? Admiral Choi sat quietly for a moment, choosing her words carefully. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried the weight of conviction that would make her response legendary across known space. We warned them because it was the right thing to do, she said simply. When you have knowledge that can save lives, you share it, regardless of how people react to that knowledge. We saved them because we had the capability to do so, and letting billions die out of spite or wounded pride would have made us monsters. She paused, looking directly into the camera. That was broadcasting to billions of viewers across the galaxy. But we've learned something important from this experience. We'll never again stand by and watch pride and arrogance destroy innocent lives when we have the power to prevent it. The universe is full of dangers that don't care about your technological sophistication or your cultural superiority. When those dangers come, the only thing that matters is whether you're prepared to face them with wisdom, humility, and cooperation. The interview became required viewing in diplomatic academies across the galaxy. Admiral Choi's words were studied, analyzed, and quoted in countless political discussions about the changing balance of galactic power. The Corthanian Empire had fallen not to human weapons or military conquest, but to something far more devastating. The complete collapse of their own arrogance when confronted with a universe that didn't care about their assumed superiority. Their elegant technology and sophisticated culture had proven worthless when faced with a crisis they were too proud to prepare for. Humanity had demonstrated a new kind of strength, not the power to destroy, but the capacity to preserve life, on an unprecedented scale. They had shown that true advancement wasn't measured in technological sophistication, but in the wisdom to listen, learn, and act for the greater good. The galaxy would never be the same. The age of dismissing younger civilizations as inferior was over. In its place rose a new understanding, that survival in a hostile universe required cooperation, humility, and the recognition that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. And, somewhere in a refugee camp on New Geneva, Corthanian children were learning to say thank you in human languages, preparing for a future where their species would rebuild not as conquerors, but as partners in the greater community of galactic civilization.